We're 3 days away from affordable insurance and nobody's answering the phone. Julia says it out loud to no one, staring at her mother's hospital bill on the kitchen table. The seizure came at 2 a.m., the ambulance at 2:14, the discharge paperwork at 6:30, with a new line item she doesn't recognize, and a copay that makes her stomach turn. Her mother is 83. She's on a fixed income, and the subsidies that keep her premiums under $200 a month are about to disappear. This isn't theoretical. It's happening in 11 days. Across the country, 22 million people are watching the same countdown. They're checking their mailboxes for renewal notices. They're logging into healthcare.gov and seeing estimated premiums that don't make sense. $450 instead of $180, $900 instead of $320. Some are calling their insurance companies. Others are calling Congress. Most are getting voicemail. Because on Capitol Hill, where the subsidies are supposed to be decided, nobody seems to be in charge. Speaker Johnson called them a boondoggle. 4 of his own Republicans just signed a petition to overrule him. The Senate promised a vote 2 weeks ago. It hasn't happened. And in living rooms across red states, where over half of those 22 million actually live, families are doing math that doesn't add up. If premiums double, what gets cut? Groceries? The car payment? Or do they just go uninsured and hope nothing happens? How did keeping people insured become this toxic? The subsidies weren't always this contentious. They were expanded during a pandemic when millions lost employer coverage and the government decided temporary relief was better than a public health catastrophe. The logic was simple: make premiums affordable, keep people covered, prevent hospital systems from collapsing under uninsured emergency visits. It worked. Enrollment surged. By some counts, it hit record highs. But temporary became permanent in the minds of the people who relied on it. And now, with the expiration looming, Congress is discovering that taking something away is harder than giving it in the first place, especially when the people losing it voted for you. The data tells a story nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. More than half the people receiving these subsidies live in districts represented by Republicans. Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, every single district in those states has at least 1 in 10 residents enrolled in marketplace plans. These aren't coastal elites or urban progressives. They're small business owners, freelancers, early retirees, and gig workers. They're people who don't get insurance through an employer and can't afford to pay full price. They're also voters. So when Speaker Johnson calls the subsidies a giveaway to insurance companies, he's technically correct. The money flows through insurers to lower premiums, but he's missing the part where his own constituents are the ones paying those premiums. And when 4 Republicans break ranks to force a vote, they're not doing it out of policy conviction. They're doing it because their phones won't stop ringing. In political terms, this is called a miscalculation. Julia didn't vote for Speaker Johnson. She doesn't live in his district, but she's watching the news coverage with the kind of focus usually reserved for weather forecasts during hurricane season, because the outcome of this fight determines whether her mother can keep seeing the neurologist who finally figured out the right medication, the one that costs $340 a month, the one insurance covers if insurance still exists. Her mother doesn't know any of this. Julia hasn't told her. What's the point? It'll either get fixed or it won't. And worrying about it just makes the seizures worse. But Julia's worried enough for both of them. She's also angry, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that builds when you realize the people making decisions about your life have never had to make the same decisions about theirs. Speaker Johnson has government-subsidized health care. So does every member of Congress. They've had it for years. They'll have it next year too, no matter what happens to the subsidies. The rest of the country isn't so lucky. There's a phrase that keeps appearing in the coverage: zero premium plans. It sounds like a scam, the kind of thing advertised on late-night TV with an asterisk you can't read, but it's not. It's what happens when subsidies are high enough that low-income enrollees don't owe anything out of pocket for basic coverage. Republicans hate it. They say it encourages fraud, that people are signing up for free insurance they don't need just because they can. Maybe that's true. Maybe some people are gaming the system, but Julia knows what happens when you assume everyone's a cheater. You punish the people who aren't. Her mother worked as a cafeteria manager for 40 years. She paid into Social Security. She saved what she could. And now, in the part of life where she's supposed to be taken care of, she's one legislative fight away from choosing between medication and groceries. That's not fraud. That's failure. And it's not just her. Down the street, there's a man who runs a lawn care business. He's 58, so he's not old enough for Medicare, but too old to pretend he doesn't need a doctor. He pays $210 a month for a bronze plan. Without the subsidies, it'll be $680. He's already done the math. If it goes up, he drops it. And if he drops it and something happens, a fall off a ladder, chest pain that won't go away, he's one hospital stay away from bankruptcy. In the next town over, a woman who teaches yoga part-time is looking at a $900 a month premium. She makes $38,000 a year. That's not enough to go without insurance, but it's not enough to afford it either. So she'll do what millions of others will do. She'll take the risk. She'll hope she stays healthy. And if she doesn't, she'll wait until it's bad enough to go to the emergency room where they can't turn her away. That's the system Republicans say they're trying to fix. Here's the part that doesn't get explained in sound bites. The fight isn't really about health care. It's about loyalty. Speaker Johnson is trying to hold his conference together with a one-seat majority, and every vote is a test of whether his members trust him more than they fear their voters. The four Republicans who signed the discharge petition, Fitzpatrick, Lawler, Bresnahan, McKenzie, didn't do it because they woke up one day and decided to be heroes. They did it because their districts are purple, their margins are thin, and voting against healthcare subsidies in a midterm year is a great way to lose. Johnson knows this. He's not stupid, but he's caught between two realities that can't coexist. Reality one, his base wants him to kill Obamacare, root and branch, no exceptions. Reality two, killing the subsidies means his members lose their seats, and losing seats means he loses the speakership. So he's trying to thread a needle that doesn't exist. The House passed a bill. It wasn't the bill Democrats wanted. It didn't extend the subsidies at all, but it had a lot of things Republicans have wanted for years. Association health plans, pharmacy benefit reforms, tax breaks for health savings accounts. It was in theory a compromise. In practice, it was a statement, we're not giving in. The Senate won't pass it. Everyone knows the Senate won't pass it. That's not the point. The point is to go on record to force Democrats to vote against healthcare reform, to create a talking point for the midterms. It's the legislative theater and the audience is voters who won't read past the headline. But the subsidies are still expiring, and the people who need them are still waiting. There's a moment in every political crisis where someone has to choose between being right and being responsible. This is that moment. The Republicans are right in a narrow sense that zero premium plans create perverse incentives. They're right that subsidies flowing through insurers inflate costs. They're even right that the system isn't sustainable without reform. But they're wrong about the timing. You don't yank coverage from 22 million people in the middle of winter and call it reform. You don't double premiums on families already struggling with rent and groceries and tell them it's for their own good. And you don't do it in an election year unless you're willing to lose. Maybe Johnson thinks he can ride it out. Maybe he believes voters will forget by November. Maybe he's counting on the economy improving or gas prices dropping or some other variable shifting the narrative in his favor. Or maybe he's just hoping someone else blinks first. In the Senate, Majority Leader Thune promised to vote. He said it back when the government shutdown ended, when Democrats agreed to reopen funding in exchange for a chance to extend the subsidies. That was the deal, funding for a vote. But the vote keeps getting delayed. First it was scheduling conflicts, then it was procedural questions. Now it's late fall and there are 11 days until the subsidies expire and the Senate still hasn't scheduled anything. Thune says there's a path forward if Democrats are willing to accept reforms. Democrats say they're willing to talk, but not if the price is letting subsidies lapse first. It's a standoff, and standoffs only end when someone gets hurt. In this case, it's Julia's mother, and the lawn care guy, and the yoga teacher, and 22 million others who didn't ask to be political hostages. Back in Julia's kitchen, the hospital bill is still on the table. She's called her mother's insurance company 3 times. The first time they said the subsidies would auto-renew. The second time they said it depends on Congress. The third time they transferred her to a voicemail box that's full. So she's doing what everyone else is doing. She's waiting. She's also planning, if subsidies expire, she'll need to find $600 a month somewhere. She's already behind on her own student loans. Her car needs new tires, and her mother's neurologist doesn't take payment plans. So Julia's looking at her budget the way you look at a puzzle with missing pieces, trying to figure out which expense she can eliminate without everything falling apart. It's not working. There's a version of this story where Congress pulls it together at the last minute. Someone proposes a short-term extension. Leadership agrees to negotiate in good faith. The subsidies get renewed for 6 months, or a year or 2 years. 22 million people breathe a little easier. That's the hopeful version. But hope isn't a strategy, and the clock isn't stopping. What happens if the subsidies expire? The actuaries have modeled it. Premiums spike, enrollment drops, younger, healthier people leave the marketplace first because they can afford to go without. Older, sicker people stay because they have no choice. And when the risk pool skews older and sicker, premiums spike again. It's called a death spiral, and it's not a metaphor. Insurance markets are fragile. They depend on balance. Enough healthy people paying in to cover the sick people paying out. Break that balance, and the whole thing collapses. That's what happened in states that didn't expand Medicaid. It's what Republicans warned about when the ACA first passed. And now, by refusing to extend the subsidies, they're about to prove themselves right by causing the exact crisis they predicted. Julia doesn't know what a death spiral is. She doesn't need to. She just knows that every scenario ends with her mother uninsured, and that feels close enough to death without the jargon. On a cold morning in the middle of the crisis, Julia logs into healthcare.gov one more time. She's hoping for a miracle. Maybe Congress passed something overnight. Maybe the premium estimate was wrong. Maybe there's a subsidy she didn't know about. The number hasn't changed. $850 a month. No subsidy. She closes the laptop. She doesn't cry. She's too tired to cry. Instead, she picks up her phone and calls her mother's neurologist. She explains the situation. She asks if there's a generic version of the medication or patient assistance program or anything that it doesn't cost $340 a month. The nurse says she'll ask. She also says gently that a lot of people are calling with the same question. Julia thanks her and hangs up. And she sits at the kitchen table and stares at the hospital bill again, because staring at it feels like doing something even though it's not. This is what legislative failure looks like in real life. Not a headline, not a vote count. Just a woman in a kitchen doing math that doesn't work, trying to keep her mother alive. And somewhere in Washington, 535 members of Congress are heading home for the holidays. The subsidies expire in 11 days. The House passed a bill that won't become law. The Senate promised a vote that hasn't happened. And 22 million people are left wondering if anyone's actually in charge or if the whole system is just running on autopilot while the people at the controls argue about who's responsible for crashing. Julia doesn't know the answer, but she knows this when the plane goes down. It doesn't matter who is flying. Speaker Johnson insists he hasn't lost control of the House. The 4 Republicans who broke ranks insist they're just listening to their constituents. Democrats insist they've been trying to fix this for months. Everyone insists they care about the people who lose coverage. But insisting isn't the same as acting, and acting isn't the same as succeeding. So the question isn't whether Congress cares. The question is whether caring matters when the outcome stays the same. Julia's mother calls that evening. She sounds tired. She asks if Julia's okay, because Julia hasn't been returning her calls. Julia lies and says everything's fine. Her mother doesn't believe her, but she doesn't push. They talk about the weather instead. They talk about Christmas. They don't talk about insurance, or hospital bills, or what happens in 11 days. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is pretend the crisis isn't coming. But it is, and pretending won't stop it. In red states across the country, people who voted for representatives who promised to dismantle Obamacare are discovering that dismantling Obamacare means dismantling their own coverage. It's an awkward realization. Some are angry, some are confused, some are calling their congressman's office and getting the same voicemail Julia got due to high call volume. The Republican members facing re-election in purple districts are now in an impossible position. If they vote to extend the subsidies, their primary challengers will call them renews and their base will stay home. If they vote against it, their general election opponents will run ads showing families who lost coverage, and swing voters will punish them. There's no good move, only bad ones and worse ones. Johnson's trying to give them cover by passing a bill that technically does something about health care without actually extending the subsidies. It's clever, in a cynical way. It lets vulnerable members say they voted for reform while blaming Democrats for blocking it. But it doesn't solve the problem, and voters tend to notice when their premiums double, regardless of who's technically at fault. In the Senate, Tune's doing the same calculation. He can hold the vote Democrats demanded and watch it fail, proving Republicans tried, or he can delay it indefinitely and let the subsidies expire by default, which at least avoids putting his members on the record. Both options are bad. He's just trying to figure out which one's survivable. Meanwhile, the people caught in the middle, people like Julia and her mother, are making plans that shouldn't be necessary. They're rationing medication. They're skipping checkups. They're calculating how long they can go without seeing a doctor before something goes catastrophically wrong. This is the cost of gridlock. Not abstract, not theoretical. Real people, real choices, real consequences. And it's all happening because 2 parties can't agree on whether helping people afford health care is worth compromising for. On the 11th day, the subsidies expire. There's no dramatic announcement, no emergency session, just a quiet deadline passing while Congress is out of town. The healthcare.gov website updates overnight, the new premiums go into effect, and 22 million people wake up to a system that no longer works for them. Some will pay the higher premiums and cut back on everything else. Some will drop coverage and hope they stay healthy. Some will end up in emergency rooms they can't afford, generating bills they'll never pay, shifting costs onto hospitals that'll shift them onto taxpayers. The system doesn't collapse all at once. It just gets a little more expensive, a little more unstable, a little more broken, and the people who broke it will blame each other while the people who needed it search for someone to fix it. Julia's mother ends up on Medicaid. It takes 3 months to process. During that time, she misses 2 neurologist appointments and has another seizure. This one's worse. The hospital keeps her for 2 days. Julia takes off work. She sits in the waiting room and watches cable news on mute because she can't stand to hear them talk about healthcare anymore. When her mother's discharged, Julia asks the doctor what happens next. The doctor says they'll adjust the medication, but they need to monitor it closely. Julia asks how much the monitoring costs. The doctor doesn't answer. This is what it looks like when policy becomes personal, when the talking points turn into hospital bills, when the people making decisions never have to live with the consequences. Julia leaves the hospital with her mother and drives home in silence. She's done calling her congressman. She's done hoping Congress will fix it. She's just trying to get through the next month and the month after that, and however many months it takes until someone remembers that 22 million people are more than a talking point. They're mothers and daughters and neighbors and strangers. There are people trying to survive in a system designed by people who never had to. They're running out of time.